Welcome to Superheroes, where today we're talking to Mr. Ian Rowe, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and co-founder and CEO of Vertex Partnership Academies. Thank you for being with us. Superheroes, a new historical series hosted by me, Dumisani, Washington. We will explore the powerful and often overlooked contributions of Black historical figures. Each episode will focus on a different figure, from the days of King Solomon hosting the Queen of Sheba to modern times, highlighting their achievements and the challenges they faced. Whether it's Harriet Tubman leading enslaved people to freedom on the Underground Railroad, or Martin Luther King Jr. fighting for civil rights in the 1960s, Superheroes will showcase the incredible strength and resilience of Black people throughout history. Through the lens of these superheroes, we will reveal the ways in which these men and women triumph against the odds time and time again, and delve into how that inspired the spirit that still continues today. Our forebears did not triumph over all they faced, defying impossible odds for us to stand here and call ourselves victims. We descended from superheroes. Ian Rowe, Senior Fellow of American Enterprise Institute, co-founder of Vertex Partnership Academies. We're so honored to have you here to have this conversation about superheroes.
I am so thankful to be here and great to be considered a superhero, but I'm looking at a superhero too, I'm sure.
I have, as I shared with you, been following your work for the last several years, maybe about the last 3 or 4, on social media, seeing different interviews.
Well, I have, it's interesting you say you followed me over the last few years. And it really has been in the last few years that while Roland's focus was in crime and police violence, for me, the sort of the truth pill that I've been talking about is just the role of family structure in education and virtually every other area that we care about, particularly within the Black community. But it actually has been phenomenal to just speak the truth, just to speak to reality and to face the kind of opposition. And we'll get into it more.
Matter of fact, you were sharing with me about your background, your father, your mother. So let's go there. I know that you are originally from Jamaica.
Yes.
Yeah. And your dad, you were telling me, worked for IBM. Give me a little bit about that background.
Well, just like all of us, our family life, our early family life, shapes who we are. And my parents, they met in Jamaica, West Indies when they were very young. My dad was working actually on a sugar plantation. He was an accountant there, very smart. He met my mom, and they started this kind of whirlwind romance back in Jamaica, where he used to pick her up on horseback, for their dates in the country. These beautiful romantic stories. But he felt that he had reached kind of his apex of what he could achieve in education in Jamaica. And at the time, Jamaica was still an English Commonwealth. And so he decided to go to England to study engineering, to go to school. And he had met my mom, so they were dating, but he decided to go. But after a few months, he said, you know what, I need my buds. That was their nickname for each other. And so he wrote for her hand in marriage. He wrote to her parents to say, I love your daughter. Please, can she come? And after much consternation, because she was young, she was 19. But my mom took a boat all by herself, took a 5,000-mile journey to England. This is in the mid to late 1950s to go be with her man. And so they got married in England. They had my brother, then they had me 7 years later in London. So I was born in London. And ultimately, my father made his way to the United States. He was one of the first Black engineers at IBM. My mom got a job working down on Wall Street for what was then Manufacturers Hanover. Some of your audience members may know the term Manny Hanny. But they lived an incredible life together. They had an adventure. They were married for 48 years before my dad passed away. So a lot of my life has been shaped by the fact that I had an incredibly sturdy foundation that my parents provided for me. I think you mentioned that your parents were married for 47 years before your mom passed away, 48 years. And so oftentimes when we talk about the Black family in particular, this narrative is very negative of absent fathers and high non-marital birth rates, which is true. But I think you and I have seen what happens when you have the power of a strong, married Black family. Doesn't mean that there isn't drama, and because relationships are hard. But the model that they laid out for me is something I've seen what's possible, and now I want to advocate for that for young people of all races to know what is possible for them.
So your brother, although the two siblings,
Yes.
you and your brother,
Yeah.
does he live in New York?
He lives in New York. He lives in Queens.
Okay, all right, yes,
Yes.
sir. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Very different personalities. So even within,
Yes, sir. Well, it's funny, for those who champion equity, I remember it was Thomas Sowell said there's not
Yes.
even equity in a house, right? The people are different.
I used it all the time. If I can't even guarantee the same outcome
Yes.
of the two parents in the same household with two different kids, how can you guarantee it across an entire society, right? The whole idea of equality of outcomes is a myth, but it's a dangerous myth when you are trying to manufacture these forced outcomes, which is what a lot of equity advocates are trying to do.
And it's interesting how what they'll do is they'll try to almost in a reverse way say that that's what the civil rights movement was about, that it was about equality of outcomes, and it was not what the dismantling of the Jim Crow system was. It was actually the opportunity for Black people to be treated like American citizens who had a constitution. I often tell young people the whole point of the civil rights movement was to dismantle the Jim Crow system that had been imposed on the Constitution.
So we were talking about the Spider-Man franchise.
Into the Spider-Verse.
Into the Spider-Verse.
That one. Yes, sir.
So one
yes,
of the best
sir.
lines out of Spider-Man
Yes, sir.
is, with great power comes great responsibility. And so with great power of freedom comes great responsibility. It comes with the risk and the reward of success or failure. So the civil rights movement didn't guarantee the deliverance, it guaranteed the opportunity. And that, I did an interview with Shelby Steele several years ago. He said the biggest concern for Black people is not slavery or racism, it's freedom. And actually handling the burden of freedom, because it means that we have the right to succeed at the greatest levels, but it also means without proper preparation, it also can mean failure. Not because of external forces, although that is a factor, but also more often than not, it can be internal forces.
And what's fascinating, Ian, is that especially in the context of Black American families, to have endured centuries of slavery, another century of Jim Crow segregation. I remember one of the interviews I saw with you, you were with Robert Woodson and Glenn Laurie and Peter, Uncommon Knowledge. I'm sorry.
Peter Robinson.
Thank you, sir. And as the preachers would say, charge this to my head, not my heart. And in that conversation, which I've shared with many other people, we've written our articles and referenced that one. The many things that you all unpacked in that, which I appreciate so much, was the century of growth, prosperity, right? From 1865 to the civil rights era, the apex of it, 1960s, right? Literally 100 years, right? In which obviously there's all kinds of difficulties and struggles and all of those things, but families intact, businesses, business owners.
Rates of literacy in the Black community, incredibly high. And somehow current day civil rights advocates just ignore that century of unbelievable growth and never ask the question, why did that change? And why can't we recreate that same level of success at a time where we're currently not facing the same laws that forcibly segregated us and forcibly excluded us from certain opportunity?
It seems to be, which is one of the many reasons why your work it resonates with us. We've been watching and following because you seem in many ways to be addressing that very thing. Here is the greatness from which we've come. it can be achieved again. There are some fundamental things that have to be addressed, and that seems to be obviously family, education. That seems to be your two of your main pillars, if you will, of your work: family and education.
Well, I have had the benefit of running schools, public charter schools, in the heart of the South Bronx for nearly the last 15 years. And prior to that, I had a great education myself. I am a product of a New York City kindergarten through 12th grade public education. I've worked for Teach for America in its early days, I placing great teachers in low-income communities across the country. Worked at the Gates Foundation, MTV. I've been on the entertainment side of this whole equation, engaging young people. So I have worked. I've been very blessed. I've worked with every kind of young person. Rich kids, poor kids, white kids, black kids, Asian kids, Hispanic kids, kids in homeless shelters, kids in foster care. I've worked with every kind of kid, and I've been doing this work long enough now, where I've seen teenagers as they've now sort of made their passage into young adulthood, right, where they're now making decisions for themselves. And I've seen kids in domestic violence situations, family dysfunction, poverty. And unfortunately, sometimes those kids make decisions that recreate the same disadvantage that they grew up in, right? And yet I've also seen kids in those same challenging situations make different sets of decisions. And the question is why? What made those students who are in the same exact types of circumstances have a different orientation about their future, who are on a different trajectory? And my observation has been that those young people have had what I call a sense of personal agency, that they had this ability to see a different life for themselves, a life of their own choosing. But this agency didn't just come from nowhere. It's because they embraced, in my observation, these 4 pillars of family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. Where family, it's not about the family that you're from, it's about the family that you are on the pathway to form, right? So even if you were in this dysfunctional relationship, young people who were able to break the cycle of disadvantage, usually as related to family, usually followed something called the success sequence, right? Where they finished at least a high school degree, then they had a full-time job of any kind, just so they learned the dignity and discipline of work. And if they had children, they got married first. So that series of decisions, education, work, marriage, then children, data shows 97% of millennials who follow that pathway of decision-making avoid poverty. And the vast majority enter the middle class or beyond. So that was my first observation of seeing young people who broke the cycle of disadvantage. They recognized that the most consequential decision they could make as a human being was to bring another human being into the world, and that there are different pathways towards that decision that have much greater likelihood of success for them and their children. So that was the first big sort of anchor for me. Family, regardless of race, was the first big decision among those young people who broke the cycle of disadvantage. Second was this idea of a personal faith commitment, that young people who I've seen break the cycle, they usually lived by some kind of moral code, usually informed by a religion. Doesn't matter if it's Christianity, Buddhism, but this idea that there was a framework to help them make those tough decisions.
A spiritual identity.
The spiritual identity. And they were usually part of a larger community of people who had an expectation that they had to live up to that moral code. And if you look at where we are now as a society, particularly young people, high levels of isolation, loneliness, even in the midst of all this technology connectedness, you're seeing loneliness at literally crisis levels, particularly in young people. But when you see young people who have a personal faith commitment, much lower levels of depression, much lower levels of loneliness and isolation. So that was my second big observation, that young people able to break the cycle of disadvantage lived by some kind of moral code informed by a religious institution. The next big thing I observed, that young people who were able to break the cycle of disadvantage usually had benefited from some kind of educational freedom or school choice. Charter schools, education savings account, a parent who moved into a nice suburb,
Right.
so they get into an apartment,
Absolutely.
so they can go to a great public school. But the bottom line is they had the opportunity to go to a school that was more aligned to their interests and had high expectations of what they could achieve. So young people, in my observation, young people who've broken the cycle of disadvantage, they're on the way to form a strong family. They had a personal faith commitment informed by some religion. They had benefited from some kind of educational freedom, which all added up to what my last E in free, which is entrepreneurship. That they have this kind of overcomer's mindset, that entrepreneurship can mean starting your own business, but it's more this idea of resiliency, that when you face the inevitable challenges, you've kind of built a foundation of support and your own mental capacity to have what I call the overcomer's mindset. So family, religion, education, entrepreneurship, free. That's the framework that I'm now putting forth, that I want to put in front of young people to say, this is something that you can say yes to, as opposed to a lot of these narratives that are trying to push kind of a victimhood narrative onto many young people of a certain race, of a certain gender, because that's how we cultivate agency in our society. So that's what I'm putting forth as my empowering alternative.
I haven't read your book yet, but I know that that's what I've seen some of the commentary on it and everything. And again, tell me the title of the book.
So my book is called Agency. And, so I'm very proud of that title, because I think most people are gravitating towards this idea that even in the face of structural barriers, we can never lose sight of the power within, of this idea of agency. But it doesn't come from nowhere, because I define agency as the force of your free will guided by moral discernment. Free will guided by moral discernment, right? So think of agency like a vector or velocity. Velocity is not just speed, right. It's speed and direction.
Accuracy.
Yeah, accuracy. And also, like, if you're a young person, how do you learn how to wield that free will? How do you exercise it? In which direction for your own life? And that's where these pillars of family, religion, education, entrepreneurship, I think, can help a young person understand the power within. But what I've learned in writing Agency and talking about these ideas, I called my book Agency, but in some ways the most important word that I want your viewers, people who read my book, to really take is courage. Because we live at a time when it takes courage to say obvious things or to speak the truth, whether it be about police violence with Roland Fryer or family structure and the real impact it has on the lives of young people. There are some folks who don't want you to talk about that because it disrupts their narrative.
You, to that point, you delineated the difference between married couples raising children and then couples. Let's go further. Why has, not just the data, has history proven that there is a difference between the two? A couple married to each other raising children, as opposed to a man, woman loving the child, right? But not the same commitment in terms of marriage. What is the difference?
So I recently did a debate with Richard Reeves, who's a social scientist at the Brookings Institute in Washington. He's written a book called Of Boys and Men. And in this book, Richard does a very good job of articulating some of the challenges facing young men. Because you do see it in the data. 50 years ago, you had young men were in the majority of students in college campuses. Now, literally, it's completely reversed, where young women are the majority. You see young men disengaging from work, relationships, excessive pornography consumption, deaths of despair. All of this phenomena is typically a male phenomena. So he does a very good job of articulating what is going on with boys. Doesn't mean there are other art issues going on with girls as well. But his prescription is that because young men are not being able to form strong relationships, particularly in low-income communities, Richard Reeves is arguing that fatherhood should now become an institution divorced from marriage and divorced from cohabitation, right? So, so I now run a new high school, Vertex Partnership Academies, where I've got my ninth graders, where he would like me to essentially say to my 14-year-old boys, you can become a dad. You don't even have to get married to the mom. You don't even have to live with the mom and the child. So I think that's catastrophic. So I debated Richard. So he's arguing for fatherhood as an institution, independent of marriage, independent of cohabitation. And I'm arguing that marriage is the institution that strengthens fatherhood. So the difference between a married father and a father, the first thing is the marriage component of being a married father is that your first bond is to your spouse, right? It is actually that commitment that you nurture and strengthen, which is what then allows that when children enter the picture, that joint commitment, that joint bond, that joint I will walk through broken glass for you is what then accrues much more reliably to children versus a relationship where you have a child with a woman where you have not made that bond and you don't have that commitment that then follows through to the child. And this is where I think speaking the truth is just so important. For women 24 and under who've had children in the last few years, I mean, almost every year, the non-marital birth rate is about 70%. For women of all races, 24 and under, it's 91% in the Black community and 61% in the white community for young women who 24 and under who have children. The data is overwhelming that the outcomes for those young adults as well as their children, much more likely to live in poverty, much more likely to have poor educational outcomes, much more likely to enter the criminal justice system. The data is overwhelming. So this idea that all family types are the same in terms of likely outcomes for kids is just completely disingenuous.
I know that you are aware of the election year of 2008 when then Senator Barack Obama gave his very famous now Father's Day speech and quoted the same stats. Well, they weren't as dire then. Now, what was that? I don't know, math, 15 plus years ago, I guess.
Yep.
I know. But he did that, and as you and I know,
he was vilified for it.
Completely. And then whenever he even ventured into that during his time in office, the people who loved him up until that point would turn on him. Where did that come from, Ian? Why did Barack Obama have so much love from the Black community, but whenever he would venture into any of these truths, some of the same people would completely turn on him?
It is honestly, as someone who supported Barack Obama, this is one of my greatest regrets, both of his presidency and his post-presidency. When he was president, right after his inauguration, there was a terrible murder in Chicago. And it was of this young woman, I think her name was Hadiah Pendleton. And she was killed because she was at a street corner in a group of kids, and she was maybe 14 or 15 at the time. A gang member mistakenly thought that this group of kids was somehow his adversary and just started shooting and killed Hadiah Pendleton. Turned out Hadiah just 2 weeks prior had been at the president's inauguration, performing, I think, for Michelle Obama, right? And so the president came to this horrible event and he spoke and he, typically when you have this kind of horrific gun violence, most presidents will, offer their condolences and wishes and call for more gun control. And he did those things, but he decided to go deeper. He said that there are things that we can't, when there's a hole in the heart, these kinds of government initiatives can't close that hole in the heart. The thing that closes that hole, the things that makes us compassionate human beings, where this kind of behavior wouldn't occur, We have to strengthen marriage and fatherhood. He had the courage to say those things literally instantaneously. Jesse Jackson, Ta-Nehisi Coates, the black Illuminati descended upon him. You can't say those things. You're ignoring the real issue of structural racism and bias and all these things. And unfortunately, President Obama, in my view, didn't stand strong. You can both simultaneously fight for whatever structural barriers you think stand in the way of young people's education. Like, I'm a big champion of school choice and charter schools, and believe me, I'm out there fighting in Albany and other places to get those laws changed so that more kids can have access to educational freedom. But that in no way negates the importance of speaking truth to young people about the factors that truly drive human flourishing. And that starts with strong families. And so President Obama, he had the courage to say it then, but he didn't have the courage to stick it out.
I remember, I was born in the late 60s, my wife and me, and one of the things that we talk about more and more often is that at the time that we were born, I was 67, she's 66. She's a few months older than me. The black family was declining in terms of statistics from where it was in the earlier part of that decade, but was still in high rates of marriage.
Sure.
Family.
Oh, certainly relative to where we are today.
Yes, sir. And I told my wife that it's interesting that when I consider that we grew up obviously like 60s, 70s, 80s, and it was in these decades that the black family experienced its greatest decline in terms of statistics, marriage, family. And what was interesting to me also, because I came up in church and I became a minister, pastor, and everything, and I still am, it was interesting to me, through casting no aspersion to my pastors and leaders and everything. We didn't have these conversations, right? Of the thousands of services that I've been in, and I'm also a musician that I played in, and everything that I could count on one hand the conversations about out-of-wedlock births, non-married couples, the type of thing. And it was very clear that as I got older, I look back, those are taboo subjects. We could preach about anything, we could talk about anything, but certain things were completely off the table.
Yeah.
And what was interesting to me is that it was as if we were in this cocoon while everything was burning around us. And so that as we got older and emerged, it's like, okay, wait a minute, I was born in the late 60s, came through this whole thing, not realizing that, as I think it was it Thomas Sowell, someone else, a nuclear bomb had gone off in the black community. Yeah. And the fallout was everywhere, but we were unaware because these weren't conversations. Now, I would imagine, and you correct me if I'm wrong, some of the conversations may not have been had actively if you were surrounded by intact families, right? Almost like you got your mom, you have your dad, you have your tribe, right? And so you're enjoying your family reunions and all those things. So why discuss maybe some of these very difficult things going on outside? What's your sense of that you've had, obviously, within the midst of that? Someone like yourself, yeah. He grows up closer to Mike, and we've seen the deterioration. What's your sense of how it maybe doesn't get discussed sometimes within the...
So I think a lot of this starts with, and I think we talked about it, the Moynihan report in the mid-1960s. So Patrick Moynihan, who ultimately became a U.S. Senator at the time, was in the Department of Labor, an economist, and they decided to study, even though there was this rising black middle class, there was a segment of the black community that was entrenched in poverty and dysfunction. Because what was really interesting was that they were seeing this growth in the black community, but suddenly there was this segment, and they really did the analysis as to why. And what they discovered was that the non-marital birth rate in the black community in the mid-1960s that they were so alarmed by was 23.6%, right? So nearly a quarter of black babies were born outside of marriage, which means 75% of black babies were born within marriage, right? And as it turns out, if you look at the decades prior, the rate of marriage in the black community was higher than the white community. It was actually one of the highest in the country. So it's only this recent phenomena.
After Jim Crow and slavery and all of those things, yes, sir.
Slavery, Jim Crow couldn't defeat the black family, couldn't. But suddenly there was this phenomenon. So here was Patrick Moynihan in the mid-1960s saying, hey, there's an issue. There is growth and prosperity in the Black community, but there's also this segment that's not happening. And unless we really focus on this, we may risk the growth that we're seeing in the rest of the community. So and what's interesting, I think all of your viewers should read that report, because he talks about the legacy of slavery and how that had this impact on this particular community. But the fact that this non-marital norming now is becoming its own avaricious force, its own culture-defeating phenomena, that you don't even need these structural barriers that may have contributed unto itself. The culture will feed on itself. For writing that report, Daniel Patrick Moynihan was attacked. In fact, the phrase "blame the victim" is credited with that whole phenomena, that he was attacked by saying, wait a minute, you're some white man coming in to report, you're blaming the very people who are suffering these conditions. You're blaming the victim. It's not their fault. It's all these structural barriers. And so Black leaders, no one rallied around the findings to say, wait a minute, I'm not blaming the victim. I'm pointing out that this is an issue that we need to address. I think that phenomena is what has influenced Barack Obama not to talk about these issues. There is power in preserving the narrative of victimhood, that if someone like me or you goes out and says, okay, yes, there are disparities, but it's not all because of structural racism. How about the fact that the non-marital birth rate in the Black community today, 50 years later, is now 70%, when Patrick Moynihan was trying to sound the alarm when it was about 1 in 4, right? And that's what we have to fight about today. When we talk about courage, being able to speak the truth, Chicago just released some data. The non-marital birth rate in Chicago, 1980, 1990, 2010, 2020. At each of those dipsticks, the non-marital birth rate has been north of 80% in the Black community. What do you think the impact is going to be on children when that is the normed condition? Because you're talking about already low-income conditions, usually dysfunctional families, and this is not to demonize single mothers. I have lots of single mothers in the schools I lead in the Bronx. They will crawl through broken glass for their kids. So being born into a single-parent household does not guarantee a lifetime of failure, nor does being raised in a married two-parent household guarantee you lifelong success. But the data is overwhelming. If we're telling young people about what the choices are that they should be gravitating towards, we'd being dishonest if we're not saying family structure is one of the most important first decisions.
So now, pivoting, Vertex Partnership Academy, you implement these things. So talk to me about it. It's charter school, you're in the Bronx, you've been doing this for a while. It's clear that somewhere your passion is coming from. So, but you're getting the pushback, right? This is not like a walk in the park, right? It's not you just educating young people. You're in the trenches. Tell me about that. Tell me about the school, what it is that you're accomplishing and wanting to accomplish, even in the midst of all the negative things coming your way.
Well, so a lot of my work is writing and researching things like upward mobility and education, but it's not enough just to talk about it. You actually have to have the courage to implement these ideas. And so for the last nearly 15 years, I've been running public charter schools in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan, elementary and middle schools. And it did some amazing things with these students. Some of our students are now old enough where they're actually finishing college, which is really amazing. But back at the end of 2020, I had made a decision that I wanted to really go to the next frontier in K-12 education, which in my view is high school reform. Because in places like New York City, and especially in this area where we just opened Vertex Partnership Academies, our new high school, only 7% of kids that start ninth grade 4 years later, graduate from high school ready for college. So 93%. So they start ninth grade, and either they drop out along the way, or they actually do earn their high school diploma, but still can't do math nor reading if they were to go to college, right? Which is worse, that you drop out, or you do what you're supposed to do, but when you get that diploma, it's not worth anything because you can't compete on equal footing. So we made the decision, again, it's not enough just to cite these statistics and to lament these conditions. Okay, well then what's the empowering alternative? What's the institution that I want to build in the Bronx to demonstrate that these young people are deserving of a world-class education and have the capacity to achieve at the highest levels? So we decided to put forth this idea. We've now just opened Vertex Partnership Academies in August of 2022, a virtues-based international baccalaureate high school. And by virtues-based, I mean that the entire school is organized around the 4 cardinal virtues of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. And it's an international baccalaureate program, which is one of the most rigorous curricula in the world. And in this model, at the end of your sophomore year of high school, you'll be able to choose the International Baccalaureate Diploma pathway, which is a college prep pathway where if you finish it, you can go to virtually any college or university in the world, or you can choose the International Baccalaureate Careers pathway, which means that you can do apprenticeships in your junior and senior year of high school. So imagine you could be studying phlebotomy to get a credential, meaning that you take blood in a New York City hospital, or study computer science or computer-aided design. So those are the kinds of opportunities we think it's going to be a world-class school. So for this good deed
it's not going unpunished, basically. Wow.
It has not gone unpunished, because in New York City, there's a cap on opening of new public charter schools. So the teachers union, the UFT, actually sued to shut us down even before we opened. Thankfully, a New York State Supreme Court judge threw out the union's case on August 16th, 2022. The first day of school was August 22nd of 2022. But it just goes to show there are forces that want to preserve the status quo. So that's why it's not enough just to talk about these ideas. It's important to, get these issues out there, but then you actually have to have to be what I call the man in the arena. If you've got a better idea, it's not just enough just to mouth it. You have to have the courage to implement it and actually experience the real challenges for why these conditions have existed for so long. It's not just like last year, only 7% of kids in District 12 graduated from high school ready for college. This has been going on for decades, for generations. So we've fought the system. We're demonstrating that it can work. We're building a world-class school in the Bronx. And that's hopefully, again, the inspiration that we want to bring to everyone who cares about these issues for young people.
Ian, this is one of the many reasons why we wanted to invite you and speak with you and have you talk to us and our listeners about in this theme of superheroes, right? And you wouldn't say this, you're a very humble man, obviously, but you could be doing anything, right? You have a beautiful career, a beautiful family, but you're in the trenches. You're actually getting the licks and the punches and everything, and you're taking them for the kids, and you're taking them for these families. And I've read some of the amazing things about your school. The parents come, they love the school. There's waiting. How long is the waiting list?
Oh, we just tripled the number of applications. When I ran my schools in the Bronx and Lower East Side, we had nearly 5,000 families on our wait list. Families just desperate for their kid to have a shot at a good education.
So the families are voting in favor of, but the system is trying to shut it down, right? And isn't that always the way? The Frederick Douglasses, the Booker T. Washington, here is what works, but here are the forces that don't want it to work, so then that becomes the fight.
And this is the simultaneous reality. We can fight a system that's creating a block on the ability to open new, great high schools. So we're trying to fight that battle while simultaneously educating the young people in our schools about the power within, about the ability for them to develop a sense of personal agency in their own lives. These two things are not at cross purposes. We can never lose sight of individual power and agency, even as we fight structural barriers. Because at the end of the day, we want a young person to understand it's not their race, it's not their gender, it's not their economic class that's necessarily going to determine their destiny, right? What's going to determine their destiny is the ability to have strong goals and commitment, leveraging these other institutions we've talked about of family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. There's a great poem that we're going to have all of our kids learn over time during their experience at Vertex Partnership Academies. It's Invictus by William Ernest Henley. The last two lines of that poem: I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Those words represent a power of what our kids have the ability to achieve. And so that's what we're trying to instill in our kids.
I could go on, and we're going to. But I tell you what, because we're going to have you back, and we want to hear more. Tell us the name of the book again, please.
So the name of the book is Agency, and you can actually now buy it in hardcover and as an audiobook.
Oh, wow.
I've done my own self-narration.
Wonderful. And then people are going to be glad to hear that. I want to say on behalf of Superheroes, the series, our organization, thank you for what you're doing, not just obviously the Black community, but beyond. It resonates. Again, I'll say it again. When we see this type of example of someone who has the ability, but also the courage, as you're teaching your own young people at the school, to actually not just believe these things, but put them into practice, right? To actually put them on the ground. And even to do it facing the backlash, the legal battles, all of those things, sending the message to those students and to those families that this is how important this is. This is important enough to Mr. Rowe to fight for you. So then it's showing them these are the things that are important to fight for, right? And obviously these are the types of things that will turn the tide on some of these negative things that you and I have been discussing. So thank you so much, Ian, for coming and spending time with us.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. This is powerful. And I'm honored to be part of Superheroes. But really what that means is that I'm trying to be, to cultivate, I guess, in some sense, the next generation of superheroes to recognize the power that they do have within their own lives.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir.